Good morning. We are in Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, 47a, the last line, which is the last line of the old packet, and then we'll go to the new packet, there are pages. So the Mishnah, which began with the laws around when the Eglah Rufa is called off, considering that we know who the murderer is, even if we can't convict him. But if we know the identity of the murderer, or as we'll learn, even if one person knows the identity of the murderer, and the Eglah Rufa is called off. Once the Eglah Rufa is done, even if they find the murderer later, they still try him for murder. He's still tried. But the Eglah Rufa itself, the procedure was done and it was done properly, and therefore it's buried properly and so on, even though later they may have found the murderer, or they identified him, or they find him, or whatever. And from there, the Mishnah went on to say that the Eglah Rufa at one point was abolished because murder became rampant. And having discussed this idea of rampant corruption causing the ban of Torah law or certain practices to be rendered obsolete, the Gemara went on to other things like that, namely the Sotah. Once there was too much promiscuity, they called off the Sotah law. And then from there, we went on to say that once Yossi ben Yezer and Yossi ben Yehuda passed away, the clusters of unified Torah thinking stopped, and dispute began to become more prevalent. So on that note of things that changed during this era, which is all the era towards the end of the Second Temple, as I mentioned, the Sotah law called off is by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is at the end of the Second Temple period. We know when he lived. Yossi ben Yezer and Yossi ben Yehuda, we know when they lived. It's a little bit before the destruction of the Second Temple. And then the next person, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, is also towards the end of the Second Temple. So I'm going to imagine that the rampant murder that called off the Eglah Rufa must have also been in that same period of upheaval and lack of leadership and rebellion and infighting and so on.
Well, that's probably what brought on the destruction.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, it did. It did. Okay, so in that vein, says the Mishnah like this, the last line. Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan the high priest, Hivir Haidayos HaMaiser. He ended the practice of Vidui Meiser. Vidui Meiser is at the end of Meiser runs on a cycle. The tithing runs on a cycle. If you own a farm in Jerusalem, or in Eretz Yisrael, I should say. So there's a yearly cycle in what has to be given first. First, there's the leket shekhampeh, the things you leave behind for the poor at your field. Then there is the truma for the kohen. Then there's the meiser for the Levi. Depending what year, maybe you're giving a tithe to the poor. Maybe you're giving a tithe, taking it up to Jerusalem. Okay, this is because it's a 7-year cycle. So there's a year cycle and there's a 7-year cycle. And when you finish that cycle, the mitzvah is to come to the temple and to say, Biarti HaKodesh Nabayis, I have fulfilled my obligation of giving all the tithes in their proper order. That was a big part of the procedure of the Meiser, was giving the tithe, but then the celebration of coming to the temple, thanking Hashem for all the bounty, and saying to Hashem, Biarti HaKodesh Nabayis, my house is clear of everything I owe. I've given all my duties in their proper order, in their proper year, and so on. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol ended that. The Gemara is going to discuss why. That practice ended with Yochanan Kohen Gadol, where no longer did people still give the tithe, but they wouldn't go to the temple to do that, to give that speech. Continues the Mishnah. Afu batalas ma'oridin v'sanoifin. He also abolished the waker uppers. I don't know if that's a word, and those who would hit with a stick. Okay, so the Gemara is going to explain more about this, but essentially, they had in the temple people whose job it was. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what I was talking about. They had people in the temple whose job it was to wake up the kohanim if they fell asleep on their night shift, and they'd walk around and striking
with a stick.
With a stick, they would literally walk around striking anyone who fell asleep on duty. So he ended that. The Gemara again is going to explain more about that. I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
Weird that it says both.
Yeah, like waking up and not just not waking up, but not just striking, but also not waking up. Yeah. Where is that? No, it's not correct. I'm sorry. It's true that existed, that they walked around waking people up, but that's not what the reference here is. The Gemara is going to tell us what it is. It's talking about waking up the Leviim before they have to sing. Right, the Levites would have to sing in the temple and they would be woken up.
So I guess falling
Or
asleep
actually,
was not you.
no, I'm sorry. No. Okay, we'll get to this. This is quite interesting, actually. The Leviim would announce, asking, so to speak, that Hashem should wake up. What does it mean that Hashem should wake up? When Jews are in pain, it's as if God is sleeping. And they're asking Hashem to arouse from Hashem compassion. And they stopped doing that. Interesting. And the stick was it was a calf. And they would hit the calf between its horns. Hold on 1 second. Where's that Sirashi? I'm not sure what the context of the calf is, but they would hit some calf between its horns so the blood would pour down onto its eyes and make it easier to slaughter it. Yep. That's what it was. I was unaware of both of those things. So I learned something new here. Okay, I guess when we get to that Gemara, we'll learn more details on that, but that's the gist. I don't know why I thought that it meant the waking people up in the middle of the night, because I know that existed, and Echan Kohen Gadol is a Kohen Gadol, so I figured maybe he had to do with that, but no, it's something else completely. Okay, forward in the Gemara on top of Zayin Amud Beis 47b. Says the Gemara, Ad Yamav, until his day, Hayapatish Makkah Yerushalayim. During the intermediate days of Yom Tif, the Chol HaMoed, between on Sukkot and Pesach, between the first days and the last days, where it's called Chol HaMoed, the weekday of holiday, in that it's still Sukkot and still Pesach, but it's not exactly Yom Tif.
Yeah.
So there are a number of laws about what one may do in terms of work on these days. And for whatever reason, it's one of these sets of laws that are taken rather lightly. There's a rabbi in Jerusalem. His name is Rabbi Farkash, and he's one of the leading Chabad poskim, one of the leading Chabad halachic ruler, decisors. And when he was beginning his career, he wrote to the Rabbi asking what he should write about. He has a gift for writing. Sorry, what should he write about? What should be his first topic to address in halacha? And Rebbe told him he should write a book on Chol HaMoed, because it's taken lightly by people. And he wrote his first book is Chol HaMoed B'Halacha. It's part of a series, Shabbos K'Halacha. He wrote a book on Nida, the laws of family purity, 2 books, 2-volume book. Anyway, so the law on Chol HaMoed is like this, that you're only allowed to do the kind of work that if you didn't do it, it would cause you a loss. So, for example, you couldn't go and find new clients on Chol HaMoed. If there was a client and you didn't speak to him and you didn't send him an email or whatnot, you'd lose him as a client. So now you're preventing a loss. That's the kind of work you're allowed to do. But to gain new business, you're not allowed to. Okay? So says the Gemara, Ad Yamav, until his day, until Yochanan Kohen Gadol's day, Hayapatish Makkah Yerushalayim. You could walk around Jerusalem during Chol HaMoed, and you can hear the hammer being banged in the smiths, because they were fixing things that if they don't fix it right away, it's going to get broken. But he ended it, because you walk around Yerushalayim and Chol HaMoed, you're coming from a small village, and your vision of Yerushalayim is these are the Orthodox pious Jews who are living in Jerusalem near the temple, and you walk around Cholamayit and you hear hammers banging. You have no idea that they're only banging and they're only working on the kinds of things that are going to get lost if they don't work. The average visitor to Jerusalem thinks this is regular work on Cholamayit. So it set the tone for, yeah, you can work on Cholamayit, why not? So he abolished that. So until his day, you could hear the hammers banging on Cholamayit, but he ended that. And finally, during his day, you didn't have to ask about doubtful tithe. And the reason is, so to explain what this is, right? We discussed the tithe. You have to give 10%. The various tithes, for the kohen, for the poor, for the Levi, and so on. And until these tithes are given, one may not eat of the remainder of the produce. So if you buy from someone, it's like a hechsher. Today you buy from someone, you don't know if it's kosher or not. You rely on the rabbis to put a stamp on it that say it's kosher. So back in the day, you'd have to have the same kind of verification about whether the requisite tithes were taken. Just like you'd have to make sure the ingredients are kosher, you also have to make sure that the tithes are taken.
Like
this is true till today. Sorry?
It's like if tax was paid on it.
Was taxes paid on it, exactly. And this is a problem till today. You go to Eretz Yisrael, when you buy fruits and over here you buy fruits and vegetables, you don't have to worry about a hechsher because fruits and vegetables are kosher. But in Israel, you got to make sure. Sorry?
So here, because we're not on Israel, it doesn't
matter
the 7 years.
All that doesn't matter here. But in Israel, you have to worry about Shemitah, Trumas, Maasros. You have to worry about these things. So you have to make sure you get everything with the hechsher there.
But when you buy, let's say, in a kosher grocery store there, you assume.
So we assume that they have a hechsher, just like every. They have a hechsher. Yeah, they would have the stamp there, especially during Shemitah year. It gets very complicated because you have to sell the field and buying from non-Jews and whatnot. That becomes very, very difficult. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted, as Rashi explains it, that if you buy from someone you're not sure as to whether or not he gave his tithe, instead of asking him about it, you just got to give your own tithe out of doubt. And therefore, he abolished this whole idea of inquiring from the seller, did you take the tithe or not? Because you buy it and give it yourself. And this itself is a whole discussion in the Mishnah. How do you know who's someone you can trust, who's someone you can't trust? And how does someone lose his status of trustworthiness? And how does someone regain his status of trustworthiness? Chaver, not chaver. That's a whole section. Okay, so this ends the Mishnah. Now the Gemara is going to analyze each section. So the first thing we do is go back to the beginning of the Mishnah in our analyzation, which is the law of. The first thing is the law that even after the Eglah Rufa procedure was done, if they find the murderer, he's still tried for murder. And we should not assume that he's atoned for by the Eglah Rufa, because Eglah Rufa is only to atone for the people, for the leadership who failed maybe to take care of this guy, but not for the actual murderer who is tried. So it says the Gemara, second line on top of Em Zayin Amud Beis, the Taf Resh. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, right, as we've noted a number of times, the Gemara will quote Mishnaic texts, Bra'isa, Tosefta, which are more elaborate than the Mishnah itself. And that's this introduction, Tanu Rabbanan. It's a quote from the Mishnaic era. Minayin, from where do we know Sh'im Nerfa Egla, that if the Egla Rufa was already decapitated, they already did the procedure. And afterwards, Nimtza, they find Ha'horig, the murderer. So where do we know She'ain Paiteres Isai, that the Egla Rufa does not exempt him from trial and eventual capital punishment if he's found guilty? Talmud Sotah comes the verse and teaches you, quote from the pasuk, from the verse, La'aretz la yechuper, and the land will not atone, L'dam asher shafach ba, for blood that was spilled in it, Ki'im b'dam shoifcha, but with the blood of the one who spilled it. So the pasuk makes it very clear. There's no atonement unless the blood of the murderer is taken as well, which is what we have to do to try the person for capital punishment. There's an interesting point here that Rabbi Steinsaltz makes. It's not in this commentary here, but just in general. This idea that it doesn't say and God won't atone. And for the land it won't atone. And this is a common theme throughout the Chumash, you see quite a bit, where the land will not tolerate idol worship, the land will not tolerate murder, the land will not tolerate, like this interesting kind of language that the land won't tolerate. And it's almost as if the Torah is telling you that the physical reality in which you live is almost like should be certainly Eretz Yisrael should be treated like a living entity that itself has feelings, and it's not just that you're bringing destruction to the person that you killed, God forbid, or destruction to your own self, but the very land itself is destroyed and the very land itself cannot stand your presence. The world you live in is corrupted by our behavior. It's not like we shouldn't think in isolation, like, oh, I'm a bad person, so it's my issue. But no. The land itself, the very environment, the world you live in, has an expectation of you, and if you fail, the land itself is demanding an atonement. It's a very powerful idea.
Everything you do affects the land.
Correct. It's true everywhere,
yeah. But
certainly in Eretz Yisrael, where there's a heightened spirituality, where the land itself is looking at you and saying, "What are you doing?"
So now, when they're explaining, you said they're explaining the Mishnah, the law. So,
yep.
So they're explaining it, and they're explaining from where they took,
the idea. That's right.
And that's from the Torah straight.
That's correct.
Say the pasuk.
That's right.
That's from the Torah.
That's correct. So the Gemara brings us the pasuk that backed up the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the murderer has to be tried, even though there was egla rufa. Where do we know that? Because the pasuk says there would be no atonement unless the person himself is tried and put to death if necessary. Okay, now comes the next halacha in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Eid echad omar re'isi asahardeg. The Mishnah said like this: if one witness said, I saw the murder, and another one witness says, no, you didn't. So what did the Mishnah say the law is? You don't do the egla rufa because they cancel each other out.
Unless there's somebody else.
Sorry?
Unless there's another witness.
Right. So if we have two, then there's something else. If we have one against one, said the Mishnah, they cancel each other out. We make as if we don't know anything, and therefore we do the egla rufa. Yeah. Now the Gemara says like this. The Gemara now does a little inference. Taima, the reason why you're going through with the egla rufa is demakreshle, because someone is denying or countering. Someone is what's the word? Canceling out his witness testimony. He said, I saw, and someone else said, no, you didn't see. But if nobody contradicted his testimony, the implication is Eid echad mehemen, one witness would be believed. And that's a unique thing. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah didn't say, well, it's only one guy and therefore it doesn't count and therefore we're going with egla rufa. The Mishnah said, no, the reason why we're not accepting his testimony is because someone else came and countered his testimony. What if no one did? The implication is that if he comes along and says, hey, I saw the murderer, we cancel the egla rufa, which would imply that one witness is believed. And this is contrary to the general rule in Torah, la yakum davar api shnayim edim yakum davar. By the word of two witnesses, do we establish the matter? This is a pasuk. So it seems to contradict the general rule of Torah that we need two witnesses to establish an event. So therefore the Gemara has to ask, from where do you know this? From where do you know this exception? That by egla rufa, we accept the testimony of one person who says, I saw the murder, and thus cancel the law, cancel the ritual of egla rufa. So says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, the Tan Rabbanan, for we learned in the Mishnah. Now quoting a pasuk. The pasuk says, the egla rufa is performed when we don't know who struck him down. That's the only time we can do the egla rufa is when we don't know who struck him down. Because that's what the pasuk says. The pasuk doesn't just say, if he's not found guilty, don't strike him down. Then we do the egla rufa. It says if we don't know, which means even if you know, and you cannot find him guilty because we only have one witness, but you still know. And once you know, we cannot do the egla rufa. That's what the Mishnah says. But if we know who the murderer is, even if one guy at the end of the earth knows the murderer, they would not do the egla rufa. Because the pasuk explicitly states we can only do the egla rufa when there's no knowledge of the murder. So if we have one person who comes and says, "I know the murder," and we cancel the egla rufa, which seems to imply, and this could even be implied from the Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to discuss this in more detail later, that even if someone who ordinarily is not accepted as a witness, here in this case they would be. If a woman comes and says, "I saw the murder," so ordinarily a woman's testimony is not valid to establish a law. But in this case, it would be knowledge of the murder, and if there's knowledge of the murder, we cancel the egla rufa. And this is going to become the premise of the discussion as we go forward. Rabbi Kiva says, "Minayin, from where do we know? The Sanhedrin, that if the Sanhedrin themselves, the high court themselves, and the high court is supposed to be there, they do the measuring. So Shero Echad, they saw one person, Shaharik es Nefesh, that he murdered someone else. They actually saw the murder. But Ve'ein Makir Noisai, they don't know who he is. They don't know his name. He ran off. They couldn't bring him to justice. But they know he murdered. Shaloyo Erfin, they would not do the egla rufa. So in this case, one could make the argument, well, they don't know who murdered. They saw, but they don't know who it is. So maybe we should do the egla rufa. So says the Gemara, no. Talmud Sotah comes to the pasuk and says that when they wash their hands, when the court washes their hands and they say, "We're not guilty," they also say, "We didn't see it." But and in this case, they did see it. So even if they saw, so in other words, like this, whether there's vision, whether if someone knows who the murderer is, cancel the egla rufa. If they saw the murder, also cancel the egla rufa, even if they don't know who he is. End quote from the Mishnaic text. And now comes the Gemara's analysis. Now, the way I know, I think I mentioned this before. How do I know that I went from the Mishnah to the Gemara? Because now the Gemara starts to speak in Aramaic. And Mishnaic texts are always going to be in Hebrew. So I know that this was a Mishnaic text because it began with Tanur Rabbanon, our sages taught. That would be us in Babylonia in the Gemara's time, saying that our sages of the previous generation, the Mishnah taught. And then when the narrative goes into Aramaic, now I know that the Gemara is speaking itself, analyzing. So the Gemara says like this, Hashta. Now this is a very important principle, which I'll explain now, and we're going to have more detail on this on Monday, God willing. But the principle is like this. The first principle we said earlier is that testimony is only established by two people. That's the rule. With two people is the matter established. This is the principle. Now here's another principle, which is what the Mishnah is about to tell us. If you believe testimony that's in front of you, you treat it as if it was two people, even if it was only one. Meaning, if Torah comes and says, here's an exception to the rule, you're allowed to believe one person. Then when you listen to that one person, you treat it as if it was two people talking to you, because Torah said you're allowed to believe this one person. So when Torah says that you're allowed to believe one person, it's not lowering the standard of accepting testimony. It's raising the standard of the single guy to the standard of Torah. As opposed to saying, Torah made an exception, and over here we're lowering the standard of what testimony you're allowed to accept. No. We're raising the status of one guy to two. Why does that matter? Says the Gemara like this. Hashta, now, the Amris that you said, Eid Echad Mehemen, one witness is believed to say, I know the murderer. Idachad, the other one guy who comes and says, no, you didn't see it. Heichi Motzi Makashle. How could he counter him? When the first guy comes and says, I saw the murder, we treat him as if he's two, right? The second guy comes and says, no, you didn't see it. What do we treat him as? Only as one guy. So it's as if you have one against two. Even though in reality it's only one against one, but because Torah believed the one guy, we give him the status of two, and now it's one against two. How could the second guy deny the first guy when the first guy has status of two? So
that's only if you believe the first guy, right?
But Torah says we do.
Oh,
that was the exception here. In the exception of the Egla Rufa, the Torah said, so long as anyone knows about the murder, we cancel the Egla Rufa, which means Torah believes this guy, even though he's one person, which means Torah gives him the stamp of two people. So another guy can't come and deny him. And that's the Gemara's question. But Ullah taught, in any scenario where Torah believes one guy, Hare kan shnayim. Treat it as if two people are speaking. Ve'ein dvarav shel echad. And the words of one person do not stand the makam shtayim in the place of two. So this is the Gemara's question, which we'll stop over here. But the Gemara on Monday is basically going to tell us that it's actually a dispute. And Ullah would actually understand the Mishnah otherwise. And he would say, you're right. We call off the Egla Rufa. Because one guy came and said, I know the murder. We treat him like two. Someone else comes and says, no, it's not true. Too bad. We already believe the two guy and we have to cancel Egla Rufa. Whereas others might say that they do cancel each other out, and we're going to have to get into that. What status does the first witness has? What status the second witness has? And how do we judge which witness gets the status of two and which one doesn't? That's going to become the discussion, God willing, on Monday. Wonderful Shabbos evening.
Thank you.